I bring you greetings from the city of Denver, Colorado, in the United States. It is very good to be with you today. Today I would like to speak with you about an emerging form of economic development, community wealth building. I believe it is deeply relevant to the theme of your conference, COVID-19, Local Democracy. I recently moved to Denver from Cleveland, Ohio, a city that is struggling to rebuild itself from its days as a declining industrial city. Denver and Cleveland are very, very different urban areas with very different histories, but they share some of the same underlying structural problems and have used some of the same failed strategies to address them. Those strategies are familiar to us all. In the United States and many other countries, much of what we call economic development in urban areas is in fact a zero-sum game, predicated on the neoliberal concept that markets must reign supreme, that ownership patterns over capital and corporations don't really matter, that rooting jobs locally is irrelevant in a global economy, and that the benefits of growth surely will trickle down and lift all boats. But in places like Cleveland and Denver, the paradigm of economic development has manifestly failed. For example, fully 30% of the population of the city of Cleveland continues to live below our federal government designated poverty line. This despite many decades of traditional economic development and many billions of dollars spent. We need to move beyond economies that are shaped and driven by the needs of capital and investors, and where labor, working people, are simply considered a cost on the balance sheet. There must be another way. At my organization, the Democracy Collaborative, we believe there is, one that centers the economy around people and their needs and the communities in which they live. Community wealth building, the process of developing local assets and institutions in ways that ensure wealth stays local and is broadly shared, emerged more than a decade ago to challenge the underlying logic and failures of this trickle-down economic development model. Last year, Marjorie Kelly and I wrote a book about this called The Making of a Democratic Economy, Prosperity for the Many, Not Just the Few. The book tells the story of people and communities across the United States and in the United Kingdom who are working to build a democratic economy using the tools of community wealth building. Let me share a couple of success stories that inspired the writing of that book. In Cleveland, Ohio, after many decades of failed economic development, as I mentioned, the city government, local philanthropy, and major anchor institutions partnered with the Democracy Collaborative to devise a strategy to localize procurement of goods and services. In other words, purchasing from local sources, renewable energy, food, healthcare, laundry services, and others. And use this localization strategy to establish a network of for-profit, worker-owned, community-based, environmentally green businesses. These are called the Evergreen Cooperatives and now have several hundred employees, and that number is growing. This business network prioritizes not just profit for absentee investors, because there are no absentee investors. It prioritizes family-supporting, living wage jobs, profit sharing for the workers, keeping money in the community, and hiring from the local neighborhoods, typically people who have been unemployed and left behind by the larger economy, and many with criminal records in their past. Deliberately created to supply goods and services directly to large place-based anchor institutions that are firmly rooted in the community, institutions like universities and hospitals that stay in place. The Evergreen Cooperatives were purposefully built as green worker-owned companies, an industrial-scale green laundry facility, a large urban hydroponic greenhouse capable of growing indoors 3 million heads of lettuce per year, and an energy production and retrofitting company. Owned by their workers, but linked by a community-serving nonprofit corporation, and with a revolving loan fund, the individual companies cannot be easily sold to private interests, nor can they easily exit the Cleveland community and take the jobs away. In a very real sense, these businesses are themselves a new form of anchor institution. They provide living wage jobs to their worker owners, who also receive a percentage of the profits, but also they return a percentage of their revenue to develop additional worker-owned cooperatives in the community that help grow the local economy. So they're not just about the workers, they're about the workers in the company and the broader community in which the companies reside. Recently, Evergreen created the Fund for Employee Ownership to acquire local companies and convert them into co-ops as part of the Evergreen network, thus expanding the number of good quality jobs in the city. In an important development that has led to greater scale, in 2018, the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry competed with the large French multinational corporation Sodexo for the full laundry contract of the Cleveland Clinic, the largest hospital in the region. To the surprise of some, Evergreen won the contract against a large French multinational, and in the process is buying out Sodexo's plant and giving each employee a raise in salary and fast-tracking them to become owners of the company. What the Evergreen Cooperatives are doing is recirculatory, multiplying and growing wealth locally for the people who create the wealth in the first place, anchoring jobs in place and building wealth that helps reverse long-term economic decline. The innovation of connecting the cooperatives directly to the purchasing power of local institutions creates what could be called a somewhat protected market that makes it possible for the companies to develop and grow while at the same time filling gaps in the local economy's capacity to deliver goods and services. As the cooperatives grow and scale through the creation of additional companies, you begin to see the potential for local, small-scale industrial planning and strategy. Now, today you'll be hearing much more, I understand, about the inspiring developments in Preston, England. But let me say a few words myself, because the model developed in Preston was in fact directly inspired by the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland. Preston is an older industrial city that had fallen on hard times. When I first visited Preston in 2012, it was known as the suicide capital of the United Kingdom due to the lack of economic opportunity. And the High Street, the main shopping district, was filled with boarded up storefronts and bankrupt businesses that no longer operated. It was quite a desolate place, I must say. Now, to address this very challenging situation, the Preston City Council, in partnership with a fantastic UK organization called the Center for Local Economic Strategies, one of the Democracy Collaborative's most important partners in the world, the Preston City Council has driven a comprehensive community wealth building strategy, far eclipsing what's been going on in Cleveland. This strategy includes repatronizing anchor institution procurement that has returned more than £70 million back to the local community, public employee pension fund investment on the high street to the tune of 100 million British pounds, partnering with the University of Central Lancashire to incubate cooperatives, and capitalizing a publicly owned bank using reserves of the city and county. In other words, a bank that the people of Preston will themselves own. In just 7 years, this strategy has saved or created several thousand jobs in the community and surrounding area. A city that once was in the bottom 20% of the country's most deprived communities has now been named by PricewaterhouseCoopers as the most improved community in the nation for 2 years in a row. The Preston Model and the initial success that has resulted is now being replicated in various ways in dozens of towns and cities across England, and has helped stimulate much larger strategies to address the fallout from the COVID pandemic economy in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Now, because of the successes we are seeing in cities like Cleveland in the US and Preston in the UK, community wealth building has grown from a simple idea, the idea that whoever owns and controls assets and capital determines the type of economy we have and who benefits from it, and turn that simple idea into the beginning of a global movement to transform the practice of economic development on our planet. Today in the United States, for example, numerous community organizing and development organizations, as well as philanthropy, have used community wealth as a framework for their programs. Several American cities have established offices of community wealth building funded by the municipal budget. And many other cities are now financing key elements of the community wealth frame: worker co-ops, employee ownership, public banks, land trusts, social enterprise, and much more. The city of New York, America's largest urban area, has issued a full-blown strategy centered on what they call policies for community wealth building. Anchor institutions, universities, hospitals, cultural centers across the United States, particularly health systems, are leveraging their economic power, localizing their purchasing, their hiring, and investment practices to build wealth in their communities and achieve important multiplier effects that reinforce and strengthen the local community. And by focusing on local production and procurement, these strategies are eliminating thousands of miles of carbon-based transportation required to import goods that could be produced locally. And by the way, as the recent and ongoing COVID pandemic has demonstrated, global supply chains are incredibly fragile. The United States was hit with a great problem of lack of necessary medical equipment to deal with the COVID pandemic. This is an opportunity to bring that production back to the country, the United States, or to your country, so that our supply chains and our national security is ever more secure and wealth is built and retained in our community. Now, there's no one-size-fits-all model of community wealth building. Preston is different than Cleveland. Cleveland's different from other places. Each local experiment is unique based on the local context, ecosystem, resources, and politics. What all community wealth building strategies have in common, however, is that they aim at improving the ability of communities and individuals to increase broad-based asset ownership, anchor jobs and resources locally, create broadly shared prosperity, and ensure local community economic stability and democratic control. Community wealth building doesn't tinker around the edges of the problems of our local economies. It's aimed at transforming the very basis of our local economic systems so that they operate in a way that produces better outcomes reliably as a natural consequence of how the system functions. Outcomes like greater wealth equality, more community stability, more beneficial environmental outcomes. Now let me end with a few thoughts about the relevance of the community wealth building paradigm and model of economic development to this moment in history on our planet. While some hope that we can somehow return to the status quo of the economy and society that existed before the COVID pandemic, the reality is the status quo has disappeared. There is no going back. Here in the United States, for example, one recent business survey has already found that close to 100,000 businesses have been closed permanently due to the pandemic, and there will be many more ahead as the cascading effects of the pandemic are felt in 2020 and 2021 and perhaps beyond. Close to 14 million people in America are now out of work, according to official government statistics, twice as many as before the pandemic started. And some research indicates that as many as 42% of the jobs lost during the pandemic will never come back. So we now must choose. We can either allow ever more concentrated local economies, an Amazon recovery, if you will, or we can lay the groundwork through community wealth building for a truly democratic economy moving forward. We need to leverage the policies and practices developed in places like Cleveland and Preston and many other places and take them to a new level. Yes, we will need to take immediate action to prevent further economic damage, but we also have to go big, go bold on implementing the principles of community wealth building, to mobilize the full weight and resources of our local public sectors and governments and nonprofit organizations and businesses that understand that the future depends on community stabilization and vitality and development and well-being for all. This is how we will rebuild our economies coming out of the COVID pandemic and rebuild our communities on a more solid and more equitable foundation. As a final word, let me not use my words, but the words of someone far more famous and learned and accomplished. The great physicist and Nobel laureate Albert Einstein once said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Never were these words truer than today. So I invite you and I challenge you in your conference, let us think and act newly and boldly together as we build democratic local economies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much, and I wish you great success in your conference and your deliberations. Thank you.